Good evening. And it is the last evening of the 2023 legislative session. And we are here to announce an agreement, and an important one, on the work that we have been doing to make sure that our nurses are caring safely for patients and that our patients are safe in our hospitals. We have reached an agreement for nurses and direct care workers and their patients while they're receiving care in our hospitals. And this is going to be known as the Nurse and Patient Safety Act. All session long, we have been making critical and transformative changes for workers across sectors across the state of Minnesota. And tonight we're adding registered nurses and direct care workers to those accomplishments. And this is, as I have said before, a big damn deal. We came to this session, of course, as you know, fighting for our efforts to keep nurses at the bedside. We came here for that. We didn't get everything that we wanted. We're not going to get everything that we need. But what we have in this provision that is going to go to the floor of the House and the Senate tonight and become law is important, transformative work for nurses, for direct care workers, and the patients in their care. Including this in this legislation will be nation-leading work on violence prevention in our hospitals. And you will hear Mary Turner again talk tonight, and you've heard nurses over and over again talking about the injuries and the harm that they're experiencing in hospitals across the state. Embedded in keeping nurses at the bedside has been this nation-leading violence prevention work. It got little attention, but it is important, it's transformative, it's included. In addition, there is loan forgiveness that was carried in the legislation. There's an analytical study of why nurses are leaving the bedside. And for the first time ever, we will get real information collected by an independent source in the Department of Health that will give us better information about why registered nurses are leaving the bedside that we can rely on to make change going forward. It's important to us. Nurses have been telling us an important story for many years now about the conditions under which they're working in hospitals across the state. And they're going to continue to care for patients, and they're going to continue to fight to make sure that they are able to do their job safely, with excellence and care. And this legislation is going to take us one step closer in pursuit of our efforts to retain our skilled nurses to care for our loved ones in hospitals across the state of Minnesota. I can't say enough how hard it is to make a compromise like this one, and it is a hard-fought compromise. We had legislation that has moved through the session, through both bodies, through multiple hearings, and here in the last couple of weeks, we've run headlong into a large corporation, Mayo, that it demanded on being excluded from this legislation. And the work that we have been doing to keep nurses focused in this legislation and patients focused in this legislation really got subsumed by a fight among corporate entities, Mayo and the other corporate hospitals. And it essentially dominated and replaced the debate that we've been having about nursing and patient safety. And that's unfortunate. And it is a proof point that I think we have to pay attention to, that the kind of nursing that I did when I first entered practice, where hospitals worked cooperatively with one another, where nurses were important employees in hospitals, has been replaced with a different model, one of hospitals competing with one another as corporate entities, with insurance plan backers, with grand baby pianos in every lobby to attract people. And I would give a lot to replace those fancy pianos with more nurses, to put the nurses back at the bedside, and we're going to continue that fight. The corporate power in healthcare is real, and we touched it, and it pushed back. Despite that, we continue to fight, and I think this is really important. Nurses don't get to walk away from patients. We don't get to walk away from a job. And tonight, I'm standing with nurses who are unwilling to walk away from the work to make sure that patients are safely cared for in our hospitals. That is the heart of this compromise. It's important. It's a big damn deal. I'm really proud of it. And the last thing I'll say, my colleagues in the Senate, and I think Sandra Feist will say this about our colleagues in the House, they stand with us. They want us to make this important progress You'll see Senator Abler, who's been with us the entire time in this legislation. We were here together at the very beginning, announcing keeping nurses at the bedside, and we're standing together here to talk about the Nurse and Patient Safety Act. This is bipartisan legislation. It's important legislation. And with that, I'll turn it next to my colleague, Representative Sandra Feist.
Hello, everyone. As Senator Murphy said, this is a really big deal. One of the first stories that I was told by my constituents was a story of a nurse who was retiring early because in her unit they had about 2 assaults per week. Workplace violence in hospitals is a very serious issue, and we are addressing it with this nation-leading legislation. But we are disappointed that we couldn't pass the entire Keeping Nurses at the Bedside Act. And I want to talk a bit about process. I'm a lawyer, and I like the details. I like to negotiate. I like to dig into the legislation that I carry and talk to all voices. And that is what we did all session. I have spent 20 hours of my life talking with the Hospital Association, with Mayo Clinic, with individual CNOs and CEOs of hospitals to make sure that their perspectives and their expertise and their voices were reflected in this bill. And this was a really excellent, very thoughtful, very well-crafted compromise bill. And it really tells me a lot about this place, that a bill like that can't pass into law. And it's incredibly disappointing. We need to listen to nurses. And I know that Senator Murphy and her colleagues and I and my colleagues in the House will continue to do that. And we are passing this historic legislation, this compromise this evening, but we have a lot more work to do. And we are very, very committed to doing it. So that's what I had last in my notes. We need to do more. and that's where I'll end it. So thank you so much.
Jim Abler from Anoka, just pleased to be part of this process. What drew me into this was my concern from talking to literally hundreds of nurses, at least 100 probably, as somebody walked the picket lines and just talked to the rank and file people about on several picket lines. It's just, they come out and people are taking off work and their children are there and they're talking about, they love nursing, they love to serve, and they don't know why somebody go home injured. They don't know why they have to get doubled back. They don't know why they went in to be this professional and they're like way overburdened, and the guilt and the grief they feel about not being able to serve the people that they know rely on them. How do they do that? Because they're absolutely professionals. And I knew it needed some work in the beginning, and so what we came up with at the end I thought was actually pretty good. It would have worked statewide. It was just simply a committee, and it would never go to arbitration. It would be a collegial team. And I think if anything's happened in this getting the violence and the safe place for nurses and patients solved is going to be a big deal. But I hope that looking forward, we can build a camaraderie that the nurses feel toward their patients working with the administration, because it should be a team. And that's what I was envisioning as I helped to craft the language in the last version. You know, no bill before its time. I'm really happy that there's a good product that we can be proud of, and that when this gets put into effect, nurses will be safer, the patients will be able to be served well, there'll be more nurses there. And I'm just pleased to be part of that. Thank you.
Good evening, Liz Bolden. I just want to share again my gratitude to Senator Murphy and Representative Feist for all of their work on this bill. It is really important to me, not just in doing my job here as a senator, but as a registered nurse and a nurse at the bedside. All session, we have done, as a legislature, we have done really great work in terms of protecting workers' rights and making sure that we are not leaving people behind. And I am really proud that with this bill that will pass tonight, we are not leaving any nurses behind. In the previous version, nurses in my district were carved out and not included. And that is not okay. We cannot leave people behind. We cannot leave nurses behind. And so I am grateful that we are listening to nurses. And as has been said, this is not all that we need to do. We know that, and we will continue that work. But this is meaningful and necessary legislation in terms of workplace violence. That is real. I can think of more nurses than I can count on one hand that I've personally worked with who have left the field of nursing because of injuries they sustained at work. It is something that happens every day across our state, and it's not okay. And this will make a difference with that. In terms of loan forgiveness, that is a real and significant issue for many, many nurses across the state. This will make a real and significant difference for those nurses. In terms of childcare assistance and being able to use scholarship dollars for childcare, that will make a real and significant difference for nurses across our state. And so I am grateful that we have a deal and a bill that we can bring that will pass, and I am committed to continuing the work to do more. And as nurses, as Senator Murphy mentioned, we don't walk away from our patients, and we have not walked away from nurses this session, and I'm really proud of this bill.
My name's Mary Turner. I'm president of the Minnesota Nurses Association. More importantly, I'm an ICU night nurse who's actually worked night shift this whole last weekend here. Today, my heart breaks for the patients in Minnesota. We came here to pass the Keeping Nurses at the Bedside Act because of the power and influence of corporate healthcare executives. That bill has died. And I'm heartbroken. For those nurses who choose to stay at the bedside, though, the language in this agreement will help them to feel safe in their jobs. It will help them to care for their children, to find relief from a heavy student loans. It will meaningfully improve the lives and the work of those nurses who choose to stay in our profession. The strong protections against the workplace violence are especially critical. This is some of the strongest language in our country as far as workplace violence protections, and it will be a godsend to many of our nurses on the most understaffed floors. It breaks my heart when I see a 26-year-old nurse who's already got back injuries and only has a few more years left in her at age 26 because they've been beaten up at the bedside. This language will help to hopefully put a stop to that kind of thing. Today's outcome and the events of the last 3 weeks makes clear that the outside power of corporate executives is alive and well. It is alive and well in Minnesota, in the halls of the power, and in the halls of our hospitals. The strong-armed bullying tactics of hospital CEOs, which all Minnesotans have suffered this last week, are the same tactics nurses experience every day in the workplace. Brave legislators champion for the people, especially lead authors of this bill, Senator Erin Murphy, Representative Sandra Feist, as well as Senator Abler, Senator Bolden, Senator Diestricht, and House Speaker Hortman. They all stood with the nurses and did everything they could to resist the crushing power of corporate demands, and they have my eternal gratitude and the gratitude of the nurses. We are thankful for your strong support, but make no mistake, these victories were not given by anyone in this building. They were demanded by the nurses, who spent hundreds of hours at the Capitol, many traveling hundreds of miles from greater Minnesota to testify on this bill and meet with legislators. They held space in the halls of power and spoke out even when they risked retaliation or termination by their employers. And I speak about those brave nurses coming up from southern Minnesota. I hope Minnesotans know how hard nurses fought, that we've been fighting for 15 years, for your care and safety. And I hope your corporate executives and our public officials know that our fight is not over, to put patients before profits in our healthcare system. And I'll say one last thing. The nurses for 15 years have come up here, not in their own self-interest, but we always have and we always will be up here to fight for our patients and fight for the people of Minnesota. We always have and we always will.
Time for questions?
Along that line,
Yeah.
Senator Bolden said some of the fight has been won, I may be paraphrasing her, in terms of the nurse safety aspect and the loan forgiveness. Clearly there is undone work as far as you folks are concerned. Mayo is a big force. They say they have acuity standards to take care of the problems that you are talking about. How do you, from a political standpoint, counteract that and move forward and ultimately, at some point, perhaps have these kinds of measures enacted in Mayo Clinic as well?
So the good news about this proposal that will become law tonight is that no one is excluded. The carve-out, the exemption is gone. It was offensive to all of us. I will speak for myself, but I know those behind me all found the demand to be carved out of a piece of legislation that is as fundamental as the safe care of patients in our hospitals was wrong. And it was an agreement in order to pass the legislation, but the carve-out itself became both the energy around this legislation displacing all of what we needed to do and talk about when it comes to safe patient care and adequate nursing staffing. It became a debate about an exemption among corporate entities. That took over the debate. So we're going to pause. The funding that was in the Health and Human Services bill that passed earlier today will stay in place for our use next term as we continue to work on these issues. And I think you heard clearly from President Turner that the work on behalf of patients and nurses isn't finished. But to your point, if we start making public policy in the state of Minnesota at the behest of or the demand by corporate entities, we will no longer be the state of Minnesota, but instead the state of a myriad of corporations making demands. We need to make sure that the laws that we are passing in the state of Minnesota apply to all of us. And that includes the ways in which people receive their care in our hospitals across the state of Minnesota. Whether you're in International Falls or Bemidji or Rochester. We want every Minnesotan getting care in our hospitals to get an excellent standard of care. And that can be delivered in places all across the state of Minnesota, in addition to the Mayo Hospital.
Not to put too fine a point on this, but the staffing committees are out.
The staffing committees are out. They are.
Everything else in? Is it just that that's out?
The muscular work on staffing is out of this legislation.
So it's the workplace protections and the loan forgiveness.
Loan forgiveness, workplace violence prevention, which is critical and nation leading, and then Department of Health with an independent contractor review, an analytical study to back up what the nurses have been telling us about why people are leaving the bedside. We're going to have better information, and that will inform our decisions.
My understanding is that it's the doctors in the Senate who are opposed to the bill. So why do you think that is? Why would doctors oppose a bill for nurses?
There were many of our colleagues, and if you were in our caucus, you would hear them say, I want to stand up for the nurses. I want to stand up for the patients. We're going to stick with the author. But that carve-out, I don't like that carve-out. I heard it from multiple members, and it became the real barrier to passage of this legislation. And the Mayo demanded a carve-out, and that demand was met, which made it impossible for us to find a path forward on the issue of staffing committees.
Senator, on Friday, you were fairly frontal in saying that the governor was responsible for your giving in on the carve-out. Can you describe who was resulting in this latest negotiation? Was the governor an engine behind this even as well?
So I think the work that you are seeing tonight is the result of the persistence of the nurses who showed up every day and continued to show up every day and greeted us this morning outside the chamber with their powerful voices, expecting that we would make progress on this issue before we were done. And I've worked all afternoon with Leader Dietzick. I know that Representative Feist has worked all afternoon with Speaker Hortman to make sure that we could get into law the necessary provisions that would advance for nurses, more safety in the workplace, loan forgiveness, childcare support, and better information about why nurses are leaving the bedside, because we know that they are. And without nurses at the bedside, we're not going to be able to take care of our patients.
Senator, how do you do it? How do you get there logistically? Is it a different bill, or will you grab one of the bills you have and amend it on the floor?
So we will use the same conference report that Keeping the Nurses at the Bedside Act is carried in. And so we will insert some new language into that. That revisor work is being done right now. It should be on the desk and able to take it up
You do
this
that
evening.
on the floor, you don't have to go back to a conference committee?
We don't have to go back to a conference committee because mostly we're subtracting language from the legislation.
Senator, I'd like to ask President Turner, if I may, and then any of the others who would care to comment. A percentage question. You've gotten some percent of what you wanted in terms of the nurse safety provisions, in terms of the loan forgiveness. But you did not get the nurses say in committees, right?
Right.
Okay. What percentage has been done and what percentage remains to be done as far as you're concerned? How important is this piece that's not going to be done this time? How important is that?
The true answer to safe staffing is to have adequate staffing or optimal staffing. All right, so there's no question about that. This is a huge disappointment not to have that part of it. But I had to refocus and remember back in 2014 when those St. John's nurses that made national news, and how in 2015 we passed the first workplace violence. And I had to refocus because at that time I vowed to myself I would not leave this profession until I have made it safer for our nurses. And so I had to put away my anger and my disappointment that I've been going through for the last week or two here. And I had to go, wait a minute. Having some of the strongest workplace language in the country here to protect our nurses, when I see so many nurses, their careers ending, even though they've got an average of $80,000 worth of debt, is tragic. And so I had to refocus and go, this is worth taking. This is huge. And I know that it hasn't made, and on top of that, that was something that Mayo originally had no problem with. So that's great. We're all happy. We're all one happy family now.
Is there a role then in the bill that is surviving? Is there a role for the state to start collecting information on workplace violence? And who will be providing that information? Should it be nurses too, or just hospitals?
So the workplace violence section of this bill has a reporting requirement to the Department of Health, and then they will create a larger report on workplace violence in hospitals.
Who's allowed to report that violence?
So the hospitals will, I brought the language with me because we've been focusing a lot on the other sections of the bill. So they will provide an annual report to the Commissioner of the Department of Health. So each hospital will provide that report. And in fact, there would be a fine if they fail to provide that information to the Commissioner.
So is there like a parallel way that nurses can report it independently of hospitals?
So this language ensures that staff and nurses are preparing the action plans and that they will have a voice in preventing violence in hospitals. So nurses will have a voice in those action plans and those annual reports.
Has there been direct contact with Mayo since their announcement, and also does this impact negotiations and conversations with them in future sessions going forward?
So Mayo has confirmed that they are comfortable. Not that we should have to ask the people that we regulate if they're comfortable with us regulating them, but they are aware that they will be covered by this law. And as are the hospitals represented by the Hospital Association. So everyone is on the same page that this is important, meaningful legislation that will be beneficial to both hospitals, nurses, and patients.
But is there a degree to that where, I mean, are things kind of, I don't want to say ruptured, but like, is that relationship affected by this situation at all?
I'm not sure what the relationship was before this situation, so I don't know that the relationship has changed much.
Representative, along the same line, if I may, as Mayo indicated, their threat is the term that was used, right? That is now rescinded, or is that a conversation with the governor's office, or do you have any? Is there anything you can enlighten us on in that area? I'm talking about their threat to pull projects to other states.
Well, I know that I plan to continue to work on this legislation into the coming year. So conversations will have to continue around what we need to do as a state to protect patients and nurses.
Can you expand a little more on the heartburn from some members of your caucus about the exemption? Because, I know that the exemption wasn't even what, you two wanted, or Mary, or any of the nurses. You didn't want that exemption, but you wanted something over nothing. You wanted staffing committees for the 90%, I think you said, of the rest of the hospital. So where were those members at, and why weren't they in agreement with you that, okay, maybe the exemption isn't great, but it's better than not doing anything on staffing? Can you explain their process there, or their thinking?
I will do my very best to explain another person's thinking. Once it was clear that the Keeping the Nurses at the Bedside Act was not going to become law, would not be signed into law, unless there was a carve out for Mayo. What came right after that then was the powerful voices of the other corporate hospitals saying, we don't want to participate either. And so it wasn't just Mayo anymore that was wanting not to be a part of this, but everybody wanted not to be a part of this. It's frustrating to me, I will say, that the important work of registered nurses isn't valued enough to be already at the already have a seat at the table when it comes to setting staffing plans. That's work for us to do into the future. But the carve-out did create a new debate that was no longer about the staffing committees. It was no longer about nurses and patients, but instead it was about the power of those entities and how they were positioning. And it really did suffocate a lot of the debate that we needed to have as we finished up this piece of legislation.
Sounds like they ramped up the political pressure at the rest of the hospitals.
It got real noisy. It did.
Nurses say that the short staffing is what leads to violence or can let violence happen. And so can you tell me, how does a violence prevention work without more staffing?
Do you want to
Oh, yeah. So the workplace violence prevention actually does incorporate reference to staffing and ensures that when staffing is potentially a factor in an incident, that a nurse is able to raise that. Actually, I believe it's all healthcare workers in that incident would be able to raise that as a potential issue. And we ensure that they won't be retaliated against if they need to assert that that could be a factor that led to the violence.
So the retaliation stuff is still in?
The anti-retaliation provision in this bill is not included in the deal. And I find that incredibly unfortunate. But there are protections here for nurses when they believe that short staffing was a factor in an incident of workplace violence.
If there was more time in the session, do you guys feel you would have been able to find a solution for staffing? And to that note, could we maybe see something introduced next year?
I think we're definitely continuing this work into next year. The conversation really got subsumed by the Mayo carve-out. And so we need to ensure that the members of the legislature are listening to nurses and are able to really look at this legislation and continue that conversation. So we definitely will be continuing this conversation into next year, and hopefully just being able to share more stories and more insights from nurses will be able to ensure that we can pass this important legislation around staffing.
Representative, along that same line, are you thinking about a change of tack in this, away from nurses committees, or is there some way that you might, that you're thinking about that might be more palatable to Mayo and the other hospitals to be able to move this forward in the next cycle?
At the heart of this, and my colleagues, I think, have learned a lot about nursing, about our ethics, about our integrity, about the standards that we are held to under our license, because I've talked about it a lot. And I think my colleagues have a better understanding that it is our responsibility as registered nurses to care to a certain standard, a high standard of care, to work within a framework of ethics, and to make sure that if the care of additional patients is unsafe for the patient, that we should refuse that assignment. That's a part of the discipline of nursing, because upmost in the discipline of nursing is making sure that the patients in our hands are safely cared for. That's our job. Our colleagues have heard a lot about that. What we ran into, and I think it should be so clear, the nurses saying we want a seat at the table. A minority voice, but a powerful voice. And as one person from Mayo said to us, the nurses will never have anything more than an advisory role. We're responsible for the patients in our care. And it's important that we have a seat at the table, a more powerful voice in setting the standard, not just doing the work. And we were touching, I think, as you would say, a ring of power that the hospitals aren't ready for. They don't want nurses at that table. So that's what we need to work through because our professional discipline requires that we're there. And if we're not there and patients are hurt at our hands, we're the ones responsible for it. So that we can't walk away from.
I apologize. Senator, I was going to ask you, they got some of this committee stuff in Oregon where hospitals and unions negotiated, and the union backed the hospitals on some legislation and vice versa, and they got it done. This is an environment where the nurses at the hospitals have been at each other's throats. When discussing different tacks, is compromise or working together possible in this environment in the future?
So from my perspective, the staffing committees would have been a path for what you're describing. And I still believe that. And I laugh every time I hear somebody say those staffing committees don't work, especially when it's somebody who's elected, because here we are at a table with strong disagreements and working our way through that. I do think that it is going to be important for nursing and important for the hospitals. And again, safe staffing in our hospitals is mutually shared. It's a mutual outcome for the hospitals, for the nurses and patients. That's where we need to get. Okay.
Can I say something about the staffing committees? So this bill, when it was introduced, was a much more kind of cumbersome concept. It had multiple committees that met much more frequently. And it was through really in-depth negotiations with the hospitals that we were able to streamline those committees and their roles and how frequently they would meet. And so when we talk about the need to compromise, the bill was already a dramatic compromise. And I don't think that it made it worse for it. I think that the hospital input made those committee structures a more, implementable vision. And so I get frustrated when we conceptually think of these committees as like a punishment and this crazy, cumbersome idea that we came up with. Like, it was a very collaboratively crafted concept. And I just think that's an important point to make.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Good job.